Okay, so this morning in the Path of Cooperation in the Spiritual Life program, I want to speak to you about cooperative work on ourselves and with others as a focus for developing unity consciousness. So there is not so much about clairvoyance today. Mostly it is about ethics. So this is a subject that is, I think, important for us as Theosophists to look into. There is a kind of theosophical ethics, and Annie Besant was very involved in developing it. It is not really well known now, I think because there is so much of an emphasis on Blavatsky. Blavatsky also is very interested in ethics, and the book there is The Key to Theosophy. But Annie Besant takes this in a different direction so that we can really think about how to relate to other people. And I've often spoken to younger people about the question of ethics, and they get excited to think that there is a theosophical ethics. So this is what I want to introduce to you today. So this will be a little like a college course. I hope it's okay. So we have to start with a working definition of ethics. From my perspective, ethics is an established and/or evolving set of principles for guiding choice-making. And it's focused on the greater good of all, according to some definition of what the greater good means. And that definition is in some way made normative within a group that is either defined by oneself or by a group as the quote-unquote all. So all of those elements are important in any ethical system. Once again, principles, choice-making, greater good of all, and then however the group or person defines the greater good, and also what is the all. So this greater good can involve any of the following aspects of personal health, well-being and happiness, or fulfillment in any degree and combination. Physical, well-being, emotional, mental, socioeconomic, and spiritual and religious. So ethical systems can be more or less comprehensive depending on how many of these aspects are involved. And then the all may involve any degree of conscious or unconscious bias. There's a lot of work being done by young people throughout the world in the idea of conscious and unconscious bias these days, about race, about gender, about sexuality, and so on. And I just wanted to point out in I think a fairly obvious way how embedded in our thinking the idea is of what is an all. So just using a political spectrum, you can have consciously inclusive thinking about an all, for example, all of the residents of a country. And that would include immigrants and so-called illegal aliens. You can also have consciously exclusive, so if you say all citizens of a country, then obviously the immigrants and the illegal quote-unquote aliens are left out. But then there's also a lot of unconsciousness. For example, unconsciously inclusive, let's say Americans. But then what do you mean? North, Central, or South Americans? In the United States, if you say Americans, Brazil doesn't exist because, as an American country. And then there's unconsciously exclusive, which is a really deeply ingrained invisible bias, where the word Americans might be used, but it excludes indigenous peoples or people of color or so on. So the funny thing, if you want to call it funny, about unconsciously inclusive and unconsciously exclusive is that they both have almost exactly the same results. Somebody is left out of the all. So when we look at an ethical system, we have to make an assessment of it based on theory. And the questions are, how comprehensive is this ethical system's vision of the greater good? Again, physical, emotional, mental, socioeconomic, spiritual, and religious. So for example, the political spectrum. is always talking about the socioeconomic good, but they may leave out of that spiritual or religious or physical or emotional aspects. And then also, how consciously inclusive is the all that's involved in the ethical system? It can be selfish and separating, or it can be unselfish and unifying. Obviously, from the theosophical perspective, the unifying, unselfish variety is the preferable one. And then we have to think in terms of a practical assessment. To what degree does the guidance offered by an ethical system allow us to realize its goals? There are many ethical systems that sound wonderful in theory, but simply can't be applied. And especially we can notice this in health and well-being and in happiness and fulfillment. Further, to what degree does the application of the ethical system cause the least injury or harm to any? The ideal, of course, is to cause no harm or injury to anyone, but I think at our stage of development, this is an ideal that we can always aspire towards, but we may never quite reach. So, if we think about the greater good of all, and think of it in terms of the least injury or harm, what does that mean about the way that we work with other people? So here we have Annie Besant. As I mentioned in my first talk, she was an activist. She was also an author. She edited many journals, even some newspapers. She was considered to be one of the world's greatest orators, in other words, a person who lectured. She was widely considered the greatest female orator of her time, but also one of the greatest ever. And the question is, could she be considered a philosopher? Unfortunately, because she was a Theosophist, academics think she couldn't possibly be a philosopher. So I wrote a paper that was published in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy a couple of years ago, and I made a point about talking about Annie Besant as a philosopher, specifically as an ethicist, which is a philosopher who deals with ethics. She was obsessed for many years of her life with an important philosophical question, which is, can ethics exist without metaphysics? Now, in this sense, metaphysics is a philosophical term. It doesn't mean New Age, like it might be if you talk about a metaphysical bookstore, which is a common way a New Age bookstore is called in America. What it means is, can you talk about ethics without talking about God or the universe or how the universe was created? It's a very difficult philosophical question, and Annie Besant had a wonderful way of coming to an answer. And I want to talk a little bit about her life so we can understand how she developed that answer. So this is her moral or ethical evolution. She started with what she considered to be revelation, which is revelation of scripture in the Christian church, the Church of England. And she was involved with that until 1873 when she dropped out. Even though she was married to an Anglican clergyman, he turned out to have been a wife-beater. And unfortunately, she suffered from that. And she was very strong and brave. And when her husband was celebrating communion, she refused to take it from him in front of the whole congregation. That's how very brave she was. So from Revelation, she let go of the idea that the Bible was revealed truth. And she thought maybe ethics could be based on the idea of inspiration. In other words, some way of, some innate sense, ethical sense that we have that inspires us, like a good conscience, for example. And this came under the idea of theism, which is a kind of religious approach to the world that believes in a God, but doesn't believe in the gospel and doesn't believe in or the Bible and doesn't believe in Jesus, for example. So that was an advance, but it didn't last very long. From there she went to an atheist stance, in other words, no God, no Jesus, no religion. This is an ethical form called utility, which means use, and she was involved with this for a number of years. Secularism was the name of the movement. What that meant was that the Church of England shouldn't also be the same as the government of England. There was a deeply entwined relationship between church and government. And some of you come from countries where that is still, to some extent, true. She eventually moved from that to becoming a socialist, including being very interested in the ideas of Karl Marx. And eventually, she decided that the best way of thinking about the moral development and ethical development was in terms of spiritual and physical evolution, which is the teaching of Theosophy. And once she adopted Theosophy in 1889, she was with it for the rest of her life. But there was one step beyond this, and that step I'm calling mysticism, which developed for her after 1893, when she went on her first tour of India. And essentially, at that point, she became Hindu in all of her thinking. Hinduism doesn't accept converts in the way some religions do, so she always had this deep feeling of having been Hindu in a past life and coming home to Mother India. But specifically for her, mysticism was involved in the feeling of oneness that comes with unity consciousness and buddhi, which I was talking about yesterday. So in 1874, she wrote a pamphlet called The True Basis of Morality. So this is before her theosophical involvement. And from her perspective, revelation, which meant the Christian Bible and priestly authority, intuition, conscience, custom, and tradition as a way of dealing with ethics was something that she investigated. Also utility, as I mentioned earlier. She had a friend who was also a secularist and a proponent of free thought, meaning thought that was free from having to be associated with the church. Charles Bradlaugh was his name. His saying was, "The greatest happiness for the greatest number without injury to any." And then she evolved to the famous Marxist statement, "From each according to his capacity, to each according to his need." But then in 1915, now she's been a Theosophist for many years, she wrote another pamphlet which was a kind of continuation of the earlier one, where she talked about her new views on things. So from her perspective, the problem with any form of religious revelation is that it's inconsistent, because it's bound up with traditions that may, after thousands of years, no longer really be relevant. But if you look carefully at the world's scriptures, you can always find valuable ethical ideals, and then what you want to do is somehow use them in your own personal system to guide yourself. And then from her perspective, intuition or conscience was faulty, but it could actually include the knowledge that you've acquired in past lives. Because as Theosophists, we understand that the law of karma governs our lifetimes, and that means that anytime we break a law, which could be a law of the cosmic universe or a law of the human universe, a moral law, then we have to make it up. And eventually, over many, many lifetimes, we learn what to do and what not to do in order to live well within the law of karma. So from her perspective, we can have an intuition that tells us what is right and what is wrong. And my personal belief is many of us who are involved in Theosophy could be called older souls. We've grown up through learning a lot about karma, and what hurts us so much about the world and what causes so much suffering is we see our own past lives played out around us in the people who don't know how to be good to each other. Whereas this is something that, in a sense, is innate within us from these many other lifetimes. And this is one of the things that draws us to the idea of universal brotherhood or unity consciousness. So then, from her perspective, the utility that was talked about by Bradlow and the Marxists was workable, but it tended to exclude some minority. You could never have an all without having exceptions to that all that were left out. So, and as far as she was concerned, what is the greatest happiness? You know, in America, the joke was a chicken in every pot and 2 cars in every garage. You know, that's happiness. So it's relative to whatever the social values happen to be. However, the theosophical ideas around evolution, she thought were very workable as long as it included not only the physical evolution that happens in biological terms, but also social evolution and spiritual evolution. With all of these things combined, it might be possible to create an ethical system that was much more embracing than any of the others that she had seen up until that time. And then when she was involved in mysticism, from her perspective, mysticism, which is direct personal experience of our oneness with all other beings, this provides validation. The principle of buddhi, as I noted yesterday, we all have it, we can all develop it. It helps us perceive the oneness in all beings. It helps us also to realize that oneness within ourselves. But once you've had this experience, you cannot use it to control the behavior of other people without tyranny. So in other words, you can have a spiritual experience of oneness, you can radiate it in every direction, you can teach it in every way possible, but if you try to force people who haven't had that experience to try to develop oneness within themselves, you have developed yourself into a spiritual authority. And sometimes this is the problem in cults, for example. So this is a reminder of Annie Besant's definition of buddhi, unity consciousness or universal brotherhood, what Annie Besant called a compassionate reason, as opposed to the mental level of judgmental reason. And again, she defined it as the faculty within ourselves that recognizes and realizes the unity of the self in all beings. This book that this definition came from, the Sanatana Dharma Advanced Textbook from 1903, is something I'll be talking about in quite a bit of detail. The book is still in print. They have some copies of it in the bookstore. I hope at some point during your time here the bookstore will be opened. I'm sure you're all drooling to find out what kind of treasures are in there. They have quite a lot of books in English in addition to the Dutch books. But Sanatana Dharma is a Hindu word for the eternal Dharma or the eternal truth or the eternal religion. The first half of the book is an explanation of Hindu religion, but the second half is a set of ethics that are derived from her understanding of Hindu religion. And it's quite an amazing thing to consider, as I think you'll agree when I'm done with my talk. So when Annie Besant joined the Theosophical Society in 1889, she was very drawn to it because the Hindu teachings that were behind some aspects of Theosophy were fascinating to her. She decided that she had to go to India, and in 1893-94, she did a 5-month tour of India. It was the first of many tours, and eventually she resettled there. It's important to understand that the idea of a white woman from England going to all of the small villages and towns in India to talk to the Indians about how amazing their religion was completely unheard of. And she had audiences of 10,000 people often when she was doing this. And it wasn't necessarily that everyone in the audience could hear her or understand her. They just wanted to see who this person was who was doing this. It was really quite amazing. She went so far as to develop in 1898 what was called Central Hindu College, because at that time the colonial British Empire was educating people to be Christians, Indian people, and what ended up happening is people were converted, but not to Christianity. They were converted to atheism. And it was partially because of all the scientific training that the educated people were getting in the universities. So she decided that it was really important to maintain the tradition of the Hindu religion and to have it taught side by side with the most advanced teachings concerning science and so on. And that was the beginning of Central Hindu College, which lasted for a couple decades. As you know, she became in 1907 the international president of the Theosophical Society. By that time, she had a home in Varanasi, which is in the northeast part of India, and also in the southeast in Adyar. In 1913, there was a political disagreement. She was pushed out of Central Hindu College, and that's when she began doing political work in India for Indian self-rule, as it was called at that time. And she's still widely regarded as a freedom fighter in India. And there are some more conservative elements of India that want to erase her memory, but she's held deeply in many Indian hearts. Now here's someone most of you have probably never heard of, an Indian philosophist, an Indian theosophist who was also a philosopher by the name of Bhagavan Das. He was always living in Varanasi. He got an MA in philosophy and joined the TS in 1885. Met Annie Besant during her tour in 1894, and they became very close friends. Bhagavan Das considered Annie Besant his spiritual mother. In 1898, he helped to found Central Hindu College. Then there was this rift with Annie Besant that happened in 1913. It was based on the idea of the world teacher, which was Jiddu Krishnamurti, when he was a very young man. From Bhagavan Das's idea, this was not a helpful or healthy direction for the Theosophical Society to go in. And in 1916, Central Hindu College was transferred into what is now Banaras Hindu University in Varanasi. He lived to be almost 90 years old, and there is much about his philosophy that I think is worth investigating. It's an extension of ideas that are already present in Hinduism, but it's brought out in a way that Western philosophers could recognize as scholarly and rigorous, but of course they didn't because he was Indian and a theosophist, which is unfortunate. His books are no longer in print. They're increasingly rare. They're not easy to read, but I've taken some time with them, and I find they're very provocative of philosophical thought. So I've invented a term to describe what was going on between Bhagavan Das and Annie Besant during the years from about 1900 to about 1910. I call it the Sanatana Dharma Project. This was an attempt to revolutionize Hinduism, but also to nationalize it, because there were so many different ideas of what Hinduism was. So it began with Sanatana Dharma Catechism. A catechism is a form of religious training by questions and answers. So the question would be, what is Hinduism? Then there is an answer. What do we believe? Then there's an answer, that sort of thing. This was made for very young people. And many, many thousands, even tens of thousands of copies of this circulated in India during that period. Then she created an elementary textbook called Sanatana Dharma, involving Hindu religion and ethics. This was intended to teach to children in grammar school and what we would now call junior high school or middle school. And then there was an advanced textbook of Hindu religion and ethics that was published in 1903 that was intended for high school and college. And both of the textbooks are wonderful. The advanced textbook does push things a little farther philosophically, so I find that it's something that I constantly want to remind myself of and keep thinking about. And then Annie Besant published a kind of English version of this that extended to the world's religions that was called the Universal Textbook of Religion and Morals. It's not the most appealing title, maybe, but it really is also very provocative. And I'll tell you a secret. The 2 volumes of it are somewhere in the used bookstore there, so let's not be like the ladies in the bargain basement clothing store who are tearing apart the dresses because they want them. We had a place like this in Boston called Filene's Basement, and I saw it. I saw it happen. So, continuing with the Sanatana Dharma project, Bhagavan Das, initials BD, wrote a series of philosophical books. One was called The Science of the Emotions, another The Science of Peace, a third The Science of Social Organization, which was based on the laws of Manu, which is a basic scripture of ethics in Hinduism. And these books are also very interesting to read. So some of the ideas from the Science of Peace are behind Annie Besant's ethical system, so I want to introduce you to them. And I have to use a few Sanskrit words. Some of them you might recognize from theosophical reading. So we have the self, the one self in all. This is Atman. This is the principle of oneness in the universe. And then there is a not self, Anatman. This is not the one, it is the many separated selves. Each of us is one of these separated selves. It's the enormous diversity of being. And any individual or separated self is called Jivatman. And that is a term that you'll sometimes find in Blavatsky's writings. And then the relationship between the self and the not-self creates a third thing, which is the world process, samsara. And in this samsara, there are 2 paths. There's a path of outgoing. In Theosophy, we call it involution, but it's called pravritti marga in Sanskrit. And this is how the separate selves are formed, how they are originated, involuted from the absolute into being on some lower plane. And then the opposite of this is the path of return, nivritti marga. This is the experience of evolution, which from the perspective of Annie Besant's ethics and from Theosophy is a reunification of separate selves into the one self. I like to think about this as a return to source. It's our journey back to source. So now all of this can start to have some application. Annie Besant had some things to say about the difference between the kinds of consciousness of someone who is on the outgoing path versus someone who's on the path of return. In the first, in other words, outgoing, the person evolves by taking, in the second, by giving back. In the first, the person incurs karmic debts, in the second, he pays them back. In the first, the person acquires things, in the second, he lets go of them. In the first, the person lives for the profit of the smaller self, the ego, in the second, for the service of the one self. In the first, the person claims rights, in the second, he discharges duties. This is the key of Annie Besant's ethics, the difference between rights and duties. Rights are something any younger or less evolved being can claim. Duties are what all more advanced beings have to, as she says, discharge. And that is the basis of selfless service. And this comes from her, the basis of morality. I tried to make my quotations gender neutral because back during her day they were always using he and she, and I skipped this one, sorry. Again, going back to the science of peace, the basis of a lot of what we experience in this world process has to do with raga and dvesha. Raga is sometimes translated as attraction, dvesha as repulsion. And raga tends to unify and devesha tends to divide. In English, I like to talk about likes and dislikes. And some spiritual teachers talk about the tyranny of likes and dislikes. So, in a sense, a good part of our spiritual growth, personally and in groups, has to do with learning how to transcend likes and dislikes, to develop a state of equanimity. So, during some part of our growth, as likes and dislikes, raga and devesha help us build our individuality. However, as seeking pleasure or avoiding pain, which is the way most people experience likes and dislikes, raga and devesha tend to create bondage in the separate self. In other words, they limit you to your ego. They create self-centeredness or selfishness. But they can be used in the form of learning to increase affection and decrease aversion, and in that case, it helps to build unity and unity consciousness. So, again, in the science of peace, we have to learn how to take avoidance of pain and convert it into sacrifice, in other words, selfless service. And in doing that, we eliminate the being bound to the ego or the separate self. And what happens here, interestingly enough, is spiritual bliss replaces the pursuit of selfish pleasure, and it increases with each stage of union with the one self. So even though we're making a sacrifice of pleasure, at the same time, we're opening to an increased experience of connection to the source. And the experience of that increased connection brings bliss. So in a sense, what we have to do is think about how we are letting go of happiness as it's usually defined in social terms, and making ourselves available to joy, that's another word for bliss, in the spiritual sense. Interestingly enough, it seems to be a difficult trade-off for a lot of people. Those of us who've experienced moments of transcendent joy and some mystical experience completely understand what it means to go after bliss instead of happiness. But the ironic thing is you can't seek it. It naturally develops from being in selfless service to others and expanding our consciousness to be more aware of their needs. So you can understand now the relationship to my earlier talk, because as I said, the basis of the third object, including clairvoyance, is the experience of oneness with other beings, and also developing those things to be in service of others. And I keep talking about climbing the ladder of lives as the method. So a little more on the science of peace. The result of selfless service and letting in spiritual bliss is inner peace, and it tends to spread to others, which gradually creates outer peace, and this is how we change the world. So, in other words, personal self-transformation in the direction of transcending likes and dislikes, and letting go of the personal ego, involvement in selfless service, climbing the ladder of lives to be of service to other more expansive levels of being, experiencing more bliss as we do that, and then developing inner peace from the equanimity that goes with transcending likes and dislikes. That's enough for a lifetime, right? But as we do this, we spread it. And other people get interested. How did you achieve this? Why are you so joyful? What does selfless service mean to you? Why does it give you happiness? I want to know more about this. And then one by one, it spreads to other people, and peace can develop from that. However, we have to keep in mind something the Dalai Lama said many years ago, and that is, look for the results of your actions in 700 years. So, the only way we can create peace instantly is to have some authority above us demanding that we achieve peace. And as I noted in an earlier slide, you can't do that because it becomes tyranny. So, ironically, the more you try to impose the idea of oneness on other people, the more you're actually creating separateness. So it can only come as something that you experience from inside. And the joy is something other people can notice and perhaps learn from. So if I were to put theosophical ethics into a list of things for us to consider, or if I would take something that Annie Besant said and lay it out in a similar form, what would it say? In Annie Besant's teaching, what we do is we train the bodies through self-restraint. That's the first step. What that means is, I'll come back to that in a moment. The second thing is we learn to practice non-harming through control of thought, feeling, speech, and action. Some of you may have heard of a movement, it's fairly common in the United States, called nonviolent communication. And it's an attempt to practice non-harming through seeing just how much harming there is in our speech. You know, when we don't like something, we could say, I could kill them. Well, how helpful is that to our spiritual growth or to them? So we have to recognize these moments when we're actually harming people in our thoughts, in our feelings, in our words, not just in our actions. And then we have to determine what our duties are. And one way of classifying our duties is according to what Annie Besant calls elders, equals, and youngers. She actually used the term superiors, equals, and inferiors, which would have been very natural for someone coming from the British Empire. It doesn't sound very good these days. That's what is called colonialism. So I think Bhagavan Das would talk about elders, equals, and youngers. I think it's a much better way of thinking about differences that we might experience when we're out in the world. And I'll say more about that later. Then we have to replace vice with virtue. Well, whoever wants to do that, right? Virtue is another one of those words we don't like to think about much. But from the perspective of the science of peace, what is vice is really any hate-based action or any harming action. Any action that's so selfish that it brings harm to others. And the opposite of that is virtue that brings love to others. So really what you replace is, you replace hate with love. And then climb the ladder of oneness, as we've been talking about already. So what is meant by training the bodies? We have a physical body, so that is what is called restraint of the senses. There are all kinds of ways in which that idea of restraint of the senses can go wrong. It isn't intended to imply ignoring everything, ignoring the good taste of food, or eating only bland food, or doing things like this. What it means is replacing outward seeking with inward seeking. If the food that you eat is something that you are always searching for and always acquiring, and you have a habit of doing that, and you're always doing the same thing, and you're doing it based on likes and dislikes, you're at least a slave to habit. And as a result of that, what I call your flexibility of consciousness has diminished. And you have a shell around you. Whatever is against that shell, you don't see. So if it should happen, for example, that you cannot go a single day without eating a hamburger from McDonald's, and there are many young people in America for whom this is true, you will never see, because of your habit, the damage that's being done in the Amazon from growing the cows for the meat for McDonald's. So this is why I say restraint of the senses is not so much about restricting yourself, but recognizing that what you think will allow you to achieve a desire that you reach out for instead of find within yourself often goes out into the world creating harm. And we need to recognize this and do something about it. At the emotional level, the necessity is learning to restrain our desires. And again, I think of this in terms of exchanging the pursuit of pleasure for following bliss and joy. It's another subject entirely, but in human relationships with respect to human sexuality, there are a lot of teachings about how it's not okay to experience sexual pleasure, outside of marriage or even inside of marriage, because marriage is only about bringing babies into the world and so on. What's lost here is a recognition that two people who come together in a relationship have the opportunity not just to merge the physical body, but also to merge the subtle bodies. And that each time this happens, this is an experience of oneness at a higher level of being. Oneness at the emotional level, oneness at the mental level, oneness at the causal or soul level. Whenever you experience any expansion of your sense of oneness, there's always bliss that goes with that. And so, a relationship, a love relationship, a romantic partnership, or marriage can be about constantly working to develop this sense of oneness at all levels of being, and then finding that there's an enormous amount of joy that you can experience. And sexuality can be a celebration of that, unless it is something that's done by habit or routine or expectation, or because the pleasure of it, but it's a selfish pleasure that ignores the well-being of the other person. You know, it's a joke about American men. So, let's make love, because it helps me sleep better. Maybe it's not only American men. So, mental, we need to think about restraint of thought. And essentially what this means is transcending attraction and repulsion, transcending likes and dislikes. Or achieving equanimity is another way of thinking about that. And then we have to train the Buddhic body, the intuitional body, and that comes through the practice of universal brotherhood and leads to the experiencing of unity consciousness. So once again, we come back to the theme of our week together. So, continuing, what is meant by the idea of practicing non-harming? We mean thought, feeling, speech, and action that is right and or true. I think they're both essentially the same from two different angles. In other words, as an expression of oneness. So what is right and true is an expression of unity consciousness. What is fitting or necessary, and I add, for moving stuckness into flow. There is no worse way to harm than to come up with a solution to things and then try to persuade or force other people to come in line with that solution. You can only use your will, and will is by its nature harming to other people. You can invite that, that's different. But the problem is a solution. Everybody has a different idea, all kinds of arguments develop from that. You cannot really have cooperative work even when you're trying to come up with a solution, because there will always be at least one step that someone doesn't agree with. And if your idea is, let's create synergy, which is one way of working consensus work with a group, there will always be someone who never gives their consent, and then the discussions go on and on and on. I have a way of reframing that. From the causal perspective, from the soul level of being, we don't deal with time and space in the way that we experience it. We deal with energies. We deal with what I call forces in play. When we do our problem solving for occultists practice, which I think comes tomorrow afternoon, I'll be talking in great detail about forces in play. So the forces in play come together. They come from many different angles. Everyone is involved, creates some element of that based on their family and social conditioning, based on their training, their level of intelligence, their level of spiritual development. And then it goes into what I call a black box. All these forces in play interact there, and the devas choose a solution from that that allows the most karma to be completed, which is one of the reasons why we often experience disappointments when we're trying to create something. The karma has come through, and we didn't recognize it was a part of all of this. We have to learn to talk to the devas, and if we do, then we can modify that. But the real secret of all of this is when the forces in play are coming together, In the present moment, there's one thing that you can do. Maybe more than one thing, but there is always one right best next step. Not just the right step, but the right best next step. You can feel it, the devas can help you understand what it is, and that step will not be a solution, it will be taking that knot of forces and finding a way to turn the stuckness of a knot into flow. Okay? So we'll be talking more about that tomorrow. So, any thought, feeling, speech, or action that is fitting or necessary for the moment as an expression of the energies that are present in the moment that can turn stuckness into flow, that's non-harming. Everybody is relieved when that happens. So the solution, all of the plans, all of the steps, it's often better in groups to just look for what the next step is. And also in our own personal lives, same principle applies. We can also ask ourselves, in terms of non-harming in thought, feeling, speech, and action, what is truly useful or beneficial or for the greater good in all of this? Here we have to be careful because of language. So my theory is that language was developed because we did not have sufficient intuitive understanding or empathy to know what other people's needs were or for them to know what our needs were. We had to learn how to communicate. As a result, everything about our language is coercive. Everything about it. Because it's all designed to persuade someone else to do something for me. Nonviolent communication is always an attempt to try to get beyond that. And there may be a heart-centered way of speaking that is as non-harming as it's possible to be, but we have to invite people to help us. We have to invite them to satisfy our needs, or we have to learn to negotiate as equals, otherwise there is harming. So this idea of the greater good is always something we keep in mind, but when we're dealing with language, we also have to make sure that we're honoring the true beingness of everybody who is involved. Anytime we attempt to persuade someone, it's using our will and it's distorting language, and it can easily be done in support of some like and dislike. So anybody who has been on a date, who has been pressured by the date to go in a direction they don't want to go, will know exactly what I'm talking about. Because that kind of pressure is, oh, it's so nice, oh, you'll enjoy it so much, but it's really about my pleasure as opposed to mutual pleasure. So we have to watch out for language. Again, it needs to be tolerant or kind in some way, both to oneself and for others, in order to be non-harming. Then it's necessary to determine what our duties are. So, duties, not a very nice word. We don't like it, especially teenagers don't like it. When the parents say you have a duty to take out the trash or something of this nature. But really what we're talking about is the service that it's possible for us to do for others, and also what is showing up in the present moment that we can do to be of service. We have to consider a number of things. All of these are forces in play. Age. Are we talking about duties to younger people, to our peers, or to elders? Or maturity. Physical maturity, emotional, mental, spiritual, they're all different kinds of maturity. Are we talking about individuals who are immature, or mature, or wise? Then there's position in terms of socioeconomics, or politics, or religion, or cultural. In this case, we don't want to talk about inferiors, equals, and superiors. We want to talk about people in terms of less, equal, and more. There's a tendency in the United States right now for people who have not had certain privileges to talk about the people who've had them as being privileged, and it's ending up having that's a bad thing to be a privileged person, and yet you can't help it. We know as Theosophists, there's an element of karma that determines where we're born, and what we do with that is everything about our spiritual growth. If we have fewer privileges, can we create a life for ourselves that transcends that? If we have a lot of privileges, can we transcend a life? Can we transcend that life? Because many times those privileges are things that would inhibit our spiritual growth. So, in terms of power, money, status, and so on, we need to think in terms of what our duties are to people with less, with equal, with more. And then finally, in terms of character or development or evolution, using the three gunas, which is a very basic element of Hindu teaching, tamas, rajas, and sattva, we can have individuals who are spiritually undeveloped. This involves the principle of tamas or inertia, or sometimes it's translated as resistance. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Then there are people who are of average development. Rajas is activity or restlessness. Then we have people who are developed. Sattva is the principle of peace or harmony that we see in these people. In a sense, what we're talking about here is the age of a person's soul. We can have young souls who are resistant to the idea of growth and who are selfish. We can have souls who are maybe a little older, a little more mature, but they're actively pursuing all kinds of goals and they're very restless, and the goals are feeding their selfishness. Then we have more mature souls. They may want to save the world, but they're also very active and restless and maybe trying to impose solutions on the world and creating harm. And then we have the developed souls who may be more at peace, who are being themselves and teachers for anyone who is willing to learn from them. So again, these are elements of things to think about when we consider duties. So here's what Annie Besant had to say about duties and rights. The birth of human beings into an organized society gives to them a claim, and to society a duty. The claim of a child on its parents, the duty of the parents to the child. It is natural and proper claim of the younger on the elder that has been perverted into the aggressive doctrine of rights. This is really a radical proposition because in all governments there are all kinds of majorities and minorities who are saying we have rights. But according to Annie Besant, there is a natural claim, but it's always the elder having the duties and the younger having the rights. As she says it, animals, children, the sick, the ignorant, in other words, the uneducated, the untrained, the helpless, all these have rights. The right to be kindly used, protected, nursed, taught, shielded. The strong, the grown-ups, they have only duties. So think about that. That comes from a little book called Theosophy from 1912. There was a copy of that among the used books. Some lucky person has taken it. It's a great little book. So I don't know who it is. Enjoy it. So what do we mean by elders? Parents or grandparents, chronological seniors, people who are older than you, teachers and mentors, employers, managers, bosses, governmental, religious authorities, evolutionary seniors, for example, initiates and masters, God or gods, the devas. So here is what Annie Besant say we owe to these beings in terms of duties. If we're coming from attraction and devotion, and our inequality is perceived as low, we give them respect, we give them esteem. If our experience of inequality is moderate, we give them reverence, like we would to a spiritual teacher. If our experience of inequality is low, we give, high, we give them worship, which may or may not be a good thing. With repulsion and intimidation, if the experience of inequality is low, we'll just feel apprehension. That's like the beginning of anxiety or fear. If it's moderate, we'll feel a real dread of being around them or being affected by them. And if it's high, we'll feel terror in their presence. So all of these attitudes imply a kind of relationship with elders. I'll do the same thing now with equals. By the way, I just want to remind people, the PDFs of all of this will be available at the end of the course. If you don't think your email is on the list, talk to me about it so I can make sure that you get them. There's a lot here that you'll want to think about. So what are equals? Siblings, our brothers and sisters, our cousins, our chronological peers that we grow up with and go through school with. For example, our co-workers, any colleagues or team members, personal friends, spouse and partner, and evolutionary peers. Think about it. Young Theosophists, in a sense, are evolutionary peers because we've all developed to a point where Theosophy appeals to us. Now that can be advanced or very advanced or only the beginning of becoming advanced or even not advanced at all. It doesn't matter. The important thing is there's a feeling of shared beliefs and values among you, and that comes as a result of being evolutionary peers to some degree. So again, looking at these in terms of our attitude, if we experience attraction and mutuality with peers, if it's low, we'll simply be polite. If it's moderate, then that develops into friendship. If it's high, that develops into love. If we experience repulsion and hostility towards equals, and it's low, we'll simply be rude. If it's moderate, then there'll be enemies. If it's high, there will be actual hatred. Now the implication of these comparisons is the direction we should be moving in, and obviously the direction we should be moving away from. And then what are youngers? Children, grandchildren, chronological juniors, those who are physically younger than we are. The infirm, the handicapped, the disadvantaged. Students, trainees, employees, subordinates, constituents, congregants, members of a church, constituents, individuals who are part of a political group, and then evolutionary juniors, souls who are less developed than we are. You know, we want to think of everyone as equal, and it isn't true, and we don't want to judge other people, but one of the most confusing things about being a more spiritually evolved soul is how to look at all of the suffering the younger souls are creating and not either be really angry about it or feel like you just don't want to be on the planet anymore. But we have to tolerate it because we were there at one point, they'll get where we are at some point later. We shouldn't judge them, we should simply understand that they're like children who are playing with toys that are dangerous, that they don't necessarily understand all of the dangers of, and hopefully we'll learn something about that without destroying everybody in the process. But if we reincarnate, then somehow I can't imagine that it would be a permanent destruction. We would find some way to come back here or perhaps on another planet. But we have to take this long view because we don't know how long it younger souls to catch up. And at the same time, we have to be compassionate, which in this sense means sadly patient, compassionate. So what is our attitude towards youngers? It can be an attraction to them and a feeling of benevolence towards them. It can be a feeling of repulsion, for example, the people that hate children because they're noisy. It can involve condescension. So with attraction and benevolence, if the inequality is perceived as low, you're kind. If it's moderate, there's tenderness. If it's high, then there's compassion. On the opposite side, if we're experiencing repulsion and condescension, if the inequality is perceived as low, we'll be self-important. If it's moderate, we'll be contemptuous. If it's high, we'll be disdainful. So the key to all of this, according to Annie Besant, is when there's a vice of some kind, meditate on the opposite virtue. And this is really important to think about because separateness spreads. In other words, hate in thought and feeling becomes hate in speech, becomes hate in action. So if we don't want hate in action, we have to stop speaking from hate. If we don't want hateful speech, we have to stop feeling and thinking in hateful ways. Unity could also spread in the same way. Love in thought and feeling becomes love in speech, becomes love in action. So that's obviously the spiritual path that we want to follow. And it's implied in the idea of climbing the ladder of lives and in the development of unity consciousness. So let's climb the ladder of oneness. So Annie Besant's version of the ladder of oneness, every word that has quotation marks around it comes from her writings. We start with the self. We move eventually to the family, which could be the so-called nuclear family of father, mother, children, to extended family, cousins, grandparents, and so on. Each of these is a stretch. Each of these is an expansion of our understanding of the ladder of oneness and what oneness means. We go from family to community. There are many kinds of communities, local, social, occupational communities that we develop in work settings such as teams, and also religious and spiritual communities. So these are not listed in order of expansiveness, just to define a few types. From there we go on to a nation. Here we can talk about different smaller political entities or locational entities. So a city or a region can also involve a level of the ladder of oneness. Also any kind of political affiliation, an economic bloc among other nations. Humanity goes beyond nation, and then we have to look at all of the questions of oneness we're challenged by in our family and social conditioning, color or ethnicity, where ethnicity is all speaking a similar language, language and culture, gender, sexuality, caste, which is in our three objects. I consider that to be an expression of socioeconomic position. Creed, which is another word that's present in our objects, that's religion. So really, there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done to overcome these divides as we climb the ladder of oneness at the level of humanity. But then Annie Besant goes on to talk about a level that involves the physical inhabitants of the earth, and at this point we need to think about the well-being of the minerals, the vegetables, the animals. If it's hard to consider the wellness of minerals, think about soils as the basis of everything that we do in terms of ecosystems, habitats for plants and animals, and then you'll understand why that's an important thing for us to think about. And we could say water just as well as soil. The non-physical inhabitants of other and invisible worlds are also included here. Nature spirits, deceased humans, angels, devas, masters. The further lectures of this week will be covering those levels. And then a few final words. Here's Annie Besant talking about theosophical morality. Recognize the unity of the self. Establish what she calls mutually helpful relations between all separated selves. So in other words, don't just be in service to others. Find some way in which there can be a mutual exchange, mutually helpful, non-harming relations between separated selves. Practice universal love as an expression of unity, the root of all virtues. I really like this. The root of all virtues is unity. Recognize love's opposite, hate, as the root of all vices, and then transform vices into virtues. In other words, hate into love. And here's what she has to say about universal brotherhood and unity consciousness. People are divided by their bodies, both dense and subtle, but they are all rooted in the one self. This teaching can put an end to wars and serve as a foundation for peace. It helps us eradicate national hatreds. It helps us end mutual contempt and suspicion. It draws all people into one human family. And that comes from the Sanatana Dharma Advanced Textbook. One thing you might notice when I read from Annie Besant is the energy in the room changes. I don't know if anybody else has noticed that, but I always feel it. There's not only a respectful silence, I think, because we honor her as an authority. Her words have this spiritual power because they come from that sense of oneness. And for this reason, as I mentioned, I've read 250 of her 600 published books and pamphlets. I love reading everything she writes because it just infuses me with that feeling of oneness. You can feel it in her expressions, in her voice. I don't know how well that would come across in a translation or for someone who's not an English speaker. native English speaker, but think about it the next time you read something about Annie Besant, whether there's something coming off the page that isn't just the meaning of the words. So I want to go back to what I said yesterday about Annie Besant and the mind of the masters. This system seems complicated. It's certainly worthy of study. It's all contained in these phrases. The consciousness of the masters stretches itself out in any direction in which they send it, assimilates itself at any point to which they direct it, knows anything which they wish to know, will to know, and all this in order that they may help perfectly, that there may be nothing that they cannot feel, nothing that they cannot foster, nothing that they cannot strengthen, nothing that they cannot aid in its evolution. To them, the whole world is one vast evolving whole, and their place in it is that of helpers of evolution. They are able to identify themselves with any step, and at that step, to give the aid that is needed. From Man in His Bodies, 1896. Now, I mentioned a spiritual practice that I believe also encapsulates all of this. At our level of development, it's fairly simple, and I think now you will understand how carefully I developed it from everything that Annie Besant said about ethics. Show up, be fully present, be kind to yourself and others, find a step to take in mutual joy. And I call this practice joyful, compassionate equanimity and service. One final slide. I was studying in the library here. I was looking at a journal from the 1920s called Herald of the Star, when Krishnamurti was thought to be the world teacher. And there was a page about the World Federation of Young Theosophists. So I made a picture of it, and I wanted to show it to you for one special reason, because this basic spiritual practice includes one more thing that's not on this slide. Motto: laugh at yourself. So that's the end of my talk. That is completely compatible, I think, with what I'm talking about. Really what you were saying is, we have a theory about it, and people claim that they believe the theory, and then the practice of it is not so clearly visible. So is that a problem with the theory or with the practice? And then you came up with a practice, essentially, which is to consider unity and diversity. So first you see the diversity, then you reach deeper, and then you find the unity. Annie Besant would be in complete agreement with that, I think. And there's another step that you can take in that direction, which is interesting to explore. I learned it in a somewhat different way from an Indian spiritual teacher named Eknath Eswaran, who lived in this country for many years. He spoke in one of his talks about a Hindu holiday. I don't remember the name of it, but you'll recognize it. The children will take the grandparents and put a blindfold over their eyes and say, "Do you want to see the Lord?" And then they will take them all over the house, and then they'll put them in front of a mirror and take the blindfold off, and now you see the Lord. Okay? So what is the name of that holiday? Do you recognize it from my description? Anybody? No? Okay. Well, be that as it may, that's what I learned. So for me, I developed a practice from that, which is not I see the Lord in you, but I see the divine in you. And so the challenge is when you're walking down a busy city street that has a lot of people in it, for example in Boston, each time I pass someone, my practice will be, when I'm doing the practice, which I don't always remember, my practice will be, I see the divine in you. It's something that I say inwardly. And they shine when I say that. And sometimes, even from the perspective of clairvoyance, that level, the soul level of them responds to me. So for example, if I'm seeing someone who is perhaps homeless and perhaps struggling with alcohol or some other substance abuse, if I think I see the divine in you as I go past them, it doesn't come for me as a kind of judgment, but sometimes a thought comes back from them, from their soul. Well, I have a strange way of showing it, don't I? But, you know, it's part of their karma maybe, although I don't want to say that to dismiss them and their needs. But seeing the divine in them has helped me feel more open, because most people walk, you know, being absolutely blind to the existence of anybody who isn't of their own color or social class or level of wealth or whatever. And sometimes I make friends that way because I will say, I see the divine in you, and I see an image of the person, not the physical person, slapping their knee, which is supposed, in American, that's like, you got it, you know, you got it. And then I'll talk to that person and find out that they're somebody who's very involved in their church or something like this, and they do have a relationship with the divine. So this is another possible expression of that practice that can lead in some interesting directions. As far as the problem that you were talking about, if I were in your situation, I would probably ask myself whether it's the theory or the way the Theosophists understand to teach it that's the problem. From my perspective, there's nothing consistent in any Besant's ethical system in the Sanatana Dharma textbooks with the idea of unity and diversity. But I also have to say, unity and diversity is a wonderful brief mantra that can be used in all kinds of ways for reframing your thought about unity consciousness. So however that translates into your home language, think about that as an interesting mantra for developing unity consciousness when you're walking around in the world.